All right, so in this session, I wanted to talk about DVC, so data version control. So normally when you're building out solutions, building applications, you normally have code repositories. So you might have a folder, something like digital mobility, and you've got all of these different files in your folder, which represent some sort of repository, which is all your code artifacts, which are related to your application solution. Now, one thing with Git is that it's really designed to store code, right? So small text files, nothing really too big. But then when it comes to machine learning, especially when you're training your models, generally more data is probably better. So you'll have a more accurate model. And so for that reason, you end up with really large data sets. So this is where DVC kind of comes in. So instead of trying to kind of version control all of your input data sets, so let's take the situation where you're building a machine learning model, right? So you've got a machine learning model. The process of building that machine learning model is you need your input data, so your features that you want to use to build and train your model. So that could be anywhere from a couple of kilobytes, could be a meg, could be a couple of gigs. It could be any size, and it really depends on what you're trying to train. So instead of just committing and saving your input data sets with your code repository, your Git repository, DVC kind of creates this kind of reference file, an index file per se. So AWS has a service, AWS S3, so simple storage service, which is really good for storing large files for long term. It's pretty economical. So for that reason, it'd be great if there was a pattern for which you could store all of your data on S3, but then be able to retrieve it when you're actually building out your machine learning models. So that's kind of where DVC kind of comes in. What it does is it automates, or it creates a systemized process for both saving, as in uploading your data into S3, and also pulling that data consistently back down to your environment for training purposes. And so what this does is it uses S3 as the storage backend, but then uses a combination of various kind of patterns in which it can version control, and has the ability to kind of track the changes of the different data sets that you're using. So let's say version 1 of your code repository is using dataset A. But then as you go on and you build different things and you find that dataset B is better, then it creates a nice way to link that up to your version 2 of your repository. Okay, so in a way, it just creates a nice kind of pattern, an ecosystem where all of your code per se is all managed in Git, and then all of your training data is managed in a storage service, say for example AWS S3, and then the way that it brings it all together is DVC kind of manages it in collaboration with various index files and artifacts that are also stored in your code repository. Okay, so we'll go through that kind of process on how to set up a DVC repository and how to really get started. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, open up command line, and I'm just going to make a new directory. I'm just going to call it DVC example. So first thing I'm going to do is it's empty, going to initialize it. So I've just initialized this directory as a new Git repository. Then I'm going to just open this location in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so it's pretty much empty at the moment. First thing I want to do is initialize my Python virtual environment. Python m. Okay, so now that I have my new virtual environment, I want to activate it. So if I check what I've got in my virtual environment, I really don't have anything at the moment. So if you go to dvc.org, let's see if they do have documentation on how to install it. Probably in the documentation, install. So you got a few options of installing it, but I just found that using it as a Python library is pretty much straightforward. So if I looked up dvc py, this is the library that I want to install, dvc. So let's just do that. Now I'm going to be using the S3 backend. Okay. So here it says to install it, pip install dvc, or depending on the remote storage, you can use in brackets S3, GS, Azure, any of these. So I'm going to just use this command. Okay, so what this is doing is just installing DVC with the S3 backend into my virtual environment. So my virtual environment is this little subdirectory in this Git repository. So if you expand this out, you can see that it's installing a whole bunch of different things for me at the moment. Okay, while that installs, then if we just go to the documentation, getting started, next thing that we're going to be doing is initializing the Git project. So this command only works in Git repositories, and that's the reason why I ran the Git initialize. I ran this command. But that's already been run, so if I run this command now, let's just check all the packages that I installed now, and we should have DVC installed. Let's just pip freeze. Okay, so this is just creating the requirements file. So that's all the packages that I'm going to need, including all the versions that have been installed at the moment. Okay, next thing we're going to run is the initialize command for DVC. And so this is just creating all of the kind of skeleton files. So here we've got a DVC ignore, and then we've also got this DVC subdirectory. And so this is just managing the DVC process. Okay. All right, so let's just before we do that, let me just create another git ignore folder here. And I just want the virtual environment not to be tracked. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm adding all these files to my Git repository, all the various DVC files, and also the requirements file, which includes all the Python libraries that I'm going to be using. Oh, actually. Okay, so now I've got my DVC already set up. Now I have to set up the remote location. Okay, let's go back. Okay, as an example, I downloaded, okay, I guess I didn't download. Let's just create a, okay. So in this directory, we're going to create a, not in this one. Let's gonna create a data directory, and in this data directory, okay, let's say we've got a data file or a data.txt. Now let's say we want to add this to our DVC repository. So what we need to do is we need to add this data directory to our DVC repository, or basically register this with DVC. And what would happen is basically it goes through a process of uploading your file into S3 and then also making the various changes to your Git repository to make sure that it doesn't actually track the actual data files, but it tracks the metadata relating to your data files. Okay, so let's go back here. And this is the kind of command that we want to run. I'm going to run something slightly different. So dvc add data. So I want to add the whole directory. Okay, so it's added the whole directory for me. And now let's have a look at this. So you can see in the git ignore file, it's now going to also ignore the data subdirectory. So that means that any files that go into this subdirectory won't actually get committed to the Git repository, but instead we're going to now track all of our changes with this data.dvc file. Okay. Okay, if we go back to here, the next thing is okay, they're going to add the data, and then we're going to, okay, let's do that. So the changes that we've made is we ran dvc add data, add this data subdirectory. That has updated the git ignore file to ignore the data directory, but now we've added a new kind of index or reference file or manifest file that would kind of represent that data. Okay, so commit. Okay, so we've added that to our DVC. Now we can, what do we do? this bit. DVC remote add -d storage and then a S3 location. Okay, so let's try and bring up the S3 location. We want to store this into this S3 bucket. Let me just work out the command that we want to run first. Okay, so this is the bucket name. So what we want to do is running the DVC command. We want to add a remote destination. So D is kind of the name or label of the destination. So this is the storage label. And it's going to be a remote location, which is pointing to S3. And then this is the bucket name. Now, as part of this command, we can also add various prefixes to this so that multiple solutions or ML flows or ML projects can all reside within the same S3 bucket. So they can all share the same S3 bucket. Okay, so for this, we'll just include the name of the project itself. Okay, so DVC example. So if we run this command now, so now we've added that new storage location into our DVC repository. And see, it's updated the config file. Let's open up this. So now it knows that there's a remote location for storage, and this URL is this location. Okay, so let's have a look at that S3 location right now. So in this S3 location, we've got a number of different S3 objects, and they have different prefixes. At the moment, we don't have one for DVC examples, but that will change after we run the following command. Okay, so git commit. Okay, so we've updated the configuration file. If we run dvc push, so our situation is we've got the machine learning model data, the input data, saved locally. But what we want to do is we want to push it and commit this up to S3 at the moment. So run dvc push. And so what it's done is push two files. It's pushed the directory plus also pushed the data itself. Okay, so it's done an upload. So if we go back over to here, and if we refresh, now we see we've got a new folder here, DVC example, and then you've got 66 and CF. So open up 66. Looks like this is the directory object. If we go back out, CF. Actually, this is the directory object. The other one was the actual file itself. Okay, so if we go back to 66, let's just open this up. Maybe I should have done that. Okay, it worked anyway. So 1, 2, 3. So the data file has been uploaded into S3, okay? Now let's say we wanted to actually retrieve the data. So for example, as I said, you might have your repository and then your data file, because it's in the get ignore, it doesn't actually track anything in this subdirectory. So let's say we had recently cloned our repository, as in downloaded the repository code, and it came down like this, basically. We don't actually have the data, so it'd be just running dvc pull. And what it would do is scan through your repository, see that you've got a DVC file and then start to download this data file. So it's downloaded everything, and now you can see that I've got my data and my data.txt file here again. So now I've kind of restored my state based on a reference file that was configured here, and also the other configurations here in the .dvc file location, telling me where to find all my actual input data sets. Okay, great. So what happens if you want to make some changes now, right? So you've got your version 1 of your code, but let's say your data input file gets more data. Okay. So now you've got more data, and then you run git status, and it hasn't tracked any changes, right? That's because Git isn't actually tracking any changes on the data subdirectory. But what you'd be doing is you'd be running dvc. So dvc, not sure whether or not you need to add it. Okay. Okay, so it's found changes. Not sure if there's a DVC status. I think because I added that. Okay. And then if you want to push these changes back to S3, it's a DVC push, and that will simply upload your data into S3 again. Now, if we head back over to S3, go back to the DVC example, now you can see that there's actually additional folders in here. So instead of 2 previously, now you've got 3. And what it's doing is it's saving each new copy of your input data sets. I think this is the new one. So let's just download this one. And there you go. Now we've got our new data set with our new data values. So what this is doing is basically giving you a nice way to kind of snapshot your input data sets and then save references to those different snapshots using DVC framework. And then it's all managed in this repository. And then all of the changes, again, changes to the DVC reference files and whatnot, they're all tracked through the traditional Git repository, where you branch, where you commit, where you push your changes in Git. So you're managing your data version control separately, but then all the configuration files and all the reference files that are related to DVC are managed and tracked through Git. Okay. So now we've got changes to DVC, Git status. This should have tracked some changes to DVC. Okay, we've got a new data file, right? We've had new values entered to this thing. So that has updated this data.dvc file. And so that's tracked here in Git. Now, let's say we wanted to go back to the previous version. Okay, so if we wanted to go back, say for example, let's go back to this version. Git check out. switching to UNA. Okay, so we've changed back to the previous state. And what I'm hoping is if I do a DVC pull, that I pull the previous version. So DVC pull. Now, hopefully I open it. Great. Okay, so I've rolled back my Git repository before adding the updated input dataset with 4, 5, 6, 7 values in my data file. And I've now also run the dvc pull command, which has gone to S3 and downloaded the appropriate file. And so, which is the version that has only 1, 2, 3. And now if we go, let's go back. Now if we check out the logs, okay, I've switched branch. If I switch back to master and then I perform another DVC pull, let's just check this. Okay, this repository should have the updated data. So I did run DVC pull and it pulls back the additional data sets. All right, so again, this only exists because it's not really, I guess, optimal to save large data files in Git repositories. And so DVC is kind of like a little add-on which builds out a nice workflow for you to kind of synchronize different input data sets with your Git repositories and keep everything in sync, but then also using the kind of benefits and strengths of AWS S3 storage to store all of your big data sets on S3 instead of your Git repository. Okay, and yeah, and so as you continue building out your solutions, you'll just have more DVC contributions, and they're just basically additional snapshots of your input data set. Okay, that's about it that I wanted to cover. And yeah, this is just probably a nicer way to manage the different input data sets as you are building your machine learning models. All right, thanks. See ya.